Good evening, everybody. So hopefully what I have to say builds quite nicely on the previous presentations. And I'm going to make the case that we need to go beyond the very welcome regulation of psychedelics for medical purposes and argue more broadly for their decriminalisation on the basis that the drug laws that prohibit them are philosophically untenable, empirically unsubstantiated, and consequently that such prohibition breaches our human rights, so such as the right to freedom of thought, also known as cognitive liberty. So first of all, thinking about what's meant by this concept of cognitive liberty. And cognitive liberty is, in one sense, synonymous with freedom of thought, but more precisely, it evokes the idea that this right should be read to acknowledge the fact that individuals should have the right to autonomous self-determination over their own brain chemistry. And given the chemical nature of human thought processes, controlling the substances that can lawfully be ingested, so prohibiting psychedelics, can be seen as an unjustifiable interference with cognitive liberty. With these molecules being the necessary and this isn't, as it's sometimes misleadingly and somewhat reductively framed, about our right to drugs, the importance of which people may agree or disagree on, but rather the seminal issue of our freedom and the extent to which it's acceptable for the state to impinge upon it. And this is the central concern of classic liberalism, perhaps most famously espoused by legal theorist John Stuart Mill. And Mill was concerned with the nature and limits of the power that can be legitimately exercised by the state over the individual. And crucially, Mill laid down the principle of the prevention of harm to others as essential to justifiable criminalisation from a liberal perspective. So liberalism rules out paternalism in no uncertain terms. The idea that the state should legislate to protect people from themselves, and yet the drug laws are explicitly premised in it, with our primary piece of drug legislation, the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, referring to a drug's potential to harm oneself as legitimate grounds for criminalisation. And with its implicit infantilization, paternalism is deeply problematic. It should remain up to us as individuals, not the state spuriously on our behalf, to prioritize whether or not we accord greater value to the psychedelic experience versus an outside risk of either physical or psychological harm. And further, even on paternalistic grounds, the psychedelic drug laws fail. How can being subjected to state punishment possibly be for an individual's own good when the primary and often solitary harm being suffered is that inflicted from on high rather than from having been high? Liberalism also rules out legal moralism, so that notorious conclusion in search of an argument. And moralism is, of course, a slippery concept. It's vague enough that it can distort unrecognisably depending upon which reality tunnel it's viewed through. However, in the realm of drug policy, it's normally used to describe a small c conservative position. So, namely, the unsubstantiated ideology that drug users should be subject to punitive measures as there's something intrinsically wrong with drug taking. And liberty comprises freedom to choose, including the freedom to make what the moral majority might consider to be bad choices. And how could it be otherwise? Who but we can decide what's of value to us? It's through such choices, including those regarding which substances to ingest or not, that we engage in self-creation. And when the law limits such choices, it curtails who we can become. And this is unacceptable in a supposedly liberal democracy designed to embrace pluralism. So Mill famously advocated experiments in living. And in accordance with this view, individuals should be free to carry out chemical experiments in the organic laboratories of their own bodies. So In line with Mill, I argue for a negative right to liberty, basically the freedom to be left alone to do as one pleases, so long as society is not thereby harmed, which is, I believe, a more authentically moral position. And crucially, the liberal spirit is enshrined within the European Convention on Human Rights, potentially according these arguments legal clout. So one of the fundamental roles of human rights protections is to patrol the boundaries between the state and the individual, guarding against unreasonable, arbitrary interference with the latter by the former. So the European Convention is embedded in our domestic law, and the courts are meant to read all legislation so as to be compatible with it, or where this isn't seen to be possible, to make a declaration of incompatibility to which the legislator must respond. And of particular relevance here, Article 9 protects freedom of thought, meaning that incursions into this right will only be valid as a necessary and proportionate response to circumstances where exercising that right would create real measurable harm in society. So our cognitive liberty is protected, on paper at least. But what's more questionable is the ease with which this right is transgressed in practice, most notably by our drug laws, without recourse to scientific proof. So the Misuse of Drugs Act, for instance, whilst ostensibly rooted in harm, clearly isn't. The best available science reveals rather that it's composed of pseudo-scientific divisions not borne out by empirical evidence, with an almost perversely inverse correlation between risk of harm and positioning therein, or indeed absence therefrom. And this is most striking in relation to the psychedelics. Whilst they pose a very low risk of harm, the vast majority of them are criminalised as Class A drugs. And that the state provides substantial rather than merely rhetorical protection of human rights is of great importance for minority groups, those that require shielding from the tendency of democracies without such safeguards to veer towards mob rule. Where human rights are being restricted, the burden of proof as regards showing harm to others should be on the state to avoid these protections being hollowed out. Human rights start to eat themselves where the law only truly respects them when they append to individuals deemed to be exercising their autonomy in an acceptable way. And whilst, of course, it would be disingenuous to deny the potential for any harm consequent to psychedelic use, such risk needs to be contextualized. Many people live lives we might consider physically, emotionally, and indeed spiritually unhealthy. But that, however, is their business, even accepting that there are undeniably consequences for broader society. The state in its various guises, as funded by the taxpayer, is often called upon to mop up the mess from unwise choices that have been made. However, that doesn't mean that such choices oughtn't still to be respected, or at the very least tolerated. There are necessary limits on what the state should be trying to achieve, certainly through the blunt tool of the criminal law. And furthermore, any potential harms from psychedelics should be weighed against their potential benefits. The fact that these substances may advantage their users remains largely absent from the drug policy debate. For instance, the idea that people should be free to take psychedelics because they enjoy them is rarely invoked, as though pleasure were a dirty word and there must be some higher motivation to get high. And this needs to be challenged to avoid implicit complicity with the underlying moral puritanism of mainstream discourse. And that's not to say that there aren't often higher motivations for getting high. Along with their hedonic properties, many users of psychedelics profess great benefits from them, up to and including enlightenment, or at the very least, transient glimpses of it, which is probably the best that we can hope for. So, whilst cognitive liberty arguments are often derided as trivial, a counter-argument is that what we're fighting for is the legal right to use substances that provide the most reliable route to the profoundest of human experiences, to what some interpret as the ultimate nature of reality, the recognition of who we truly are. And in the context of the long story of human evolution, prohibition is a relatively recent phenomenon. We've been doing drugs a lot longer than we've been doing prohibition, with strong evidence of humanity having taken psychoactive substances in almost all cultures throughout deep history, traditionally in their plant forms. And indeed, the states of consciousness these plants can open us up to are the substrate of many of our mystical and religious traditions. And of course, the focus of the event this evening, psychedelics can be instruments of healing. And indeed, as we've been hearing, they're fast gaining legitimacy in the medical realm, in the field of psychotherapy, where they're showing great promise in treating a range of mental health conditions. So from PTSD to depression, to addiction, to end-of-life anxiety. None of which, incidentally, is news to the underground psychotherapists who've continued using them with their clients over the years. And this renaissance of overground psychedelic psychotherapy is wonderful, but we mustn't stop there. There's good evidence that psychedelics can be of benefit to so-called healthy people, with these substances being pivotal to enhancing our potential to exist in the world in a meaningful way, helping us to connect. And the converse of connection, disconnection, can be seen to be at the root of much human suffering, along with the destructive acting out that can ensue in its wake. And there's some really interesting work on this coming from across many different disciplines, looking at how the mystical experience that psychedelics can engender, that felt sense of oneness, which is the ultimate reconnection, not only helps the neurotic chatter of the ego-bound self to pipe down at least a little, but can also lead to a deeper appreciation of our entanglement with and concern for those around us, for our broader environment. An acknowledgement of this fact that the benefit users might accrue from their psychedelic use often consequently advantages society as a whole is legally significant. It punctures the notion that a choice of necessity has to be made between either respecting the freedom of individuals to use psychedelics or protecting society from such psychedelic use. As is rendered apparent by the psychedelic experience, dichotomies between self and other are illusory, and we need autonomous, self-realized individuals to help society to progress. However, hopes for progressive human rights informed psychedelic drug policy reform seem perhaps ever further away, at least in the UK, given that in 2016, the Psychoactive Substances Act was passed, a piece of legislation that creates a blanket ban on trade in any substance capable of producing a psychoactive effect. And the stated aim of the Psychoactive Substances Act is to make provision about psychoactive substances. And this seemingly innocuous statement insidiously uncouples drug legislation from the concept of harm, which has traditionally, at least ostensibly, underpinned the area as embodied within the proclaimed intentions of the Misuse of Drugs Act 1971, namely to make provision with respect to dangerous or otherwise harmful drugs. And now, of course, I've already alluded to some of the well-documented problems with how the earlier legislation is deployed in practice, such as the questionable classification of the psychedelics. However, the fact that the Psychoactive Substances Act removes even the charade of drug policy being about reducing harm is alarming. Indeed, this divorcing of drug prohibition from harm is its whole raison d'etre, drafted as it was to avoid the cumbersome process of having to at least go through the motions of demonstrating that a substance is harmful before its inclusion in the prohibitive system, as required by the Misuse of Drugs Act. The Psychoactive Substances Act is thus fundamentally illiberal, legal moralism writ large. Section 2 of the Psychoactive Substances Act defines a psychoactive substance as any substance which affects the person's mental functioning or emotional state. And as such, the Act can be seen as an unmasked threat to cognitive liberty, unfortunately vindicating those of us who've long argued that drug policy is as much concerned with controlling mind states as preventing harm. To reiterate, the role of the criminal law should be to prevent harm to society, not to prevent people from traversing other mindscapes, from making the conscious decision to explore their own consciousness. And while the motivation behind this piece of legislation was the perceived need to address the growing phenomenon of novel psychoactive substances, the absence of the word novel in the Act means that it also criminalises the ancient plant medicines, ironically conflated with drugs of abuse, addiction to which they can help to break. So addiction can be conceptualised as a repeated, fruitless attempt to fill a spiritual void, a sense of lack that the plant medicines can actually address. And relatedly, and tying back to points I made earlier, given that many who use plant medicines experience them as enabling direct contact with the divine, the fact that they've now been prohibited is a clear breach of not only the right to freedom of thought, to cognitive liberty, but also to religious freedom. And indeed, this development emphasises yet further the importance of approaching drug policy from the perspective of human rights, ensuring a healthy relationship between the state and the individual. As evidence, when that's lost, the state believes that it has the right to tell people that they can't ingest anything that has a psychoactive effect unless they've been given explicit permission to do so. And ironically, exemptions from the legislation include those potentially extremely harmful yet culturally sanctioned psychoactive substances, alcohol and tobacco, rendering the Act internally incoherent. Given the earlier failure to include alcohol and tobacco in the Misuse of Drugs Act, their explicit exemption from the Psychoactive Substances Act merely foregrounds a problem of silent hypocrisy that has long been the backdrop to drug policy, undermining respect for the law for generations. The fact that drinkers of alcohol can alter their consciousness freely, their Article 9 rights to cognitive liberty undisturbed by state sanction, despite the risk of harm they pose to others, while psychedelic users are persecuted, exposes the shakiness, the moral high ground on which. So to conclude, drug policy ought not to be based on the drug preferences of those with power, but rather rooted in human rights and the best available scientific evidence. Thank you.